Day 42. The candle I lit 3 hours ago is almost gone. I keep forgetting that candles run out. That's a thing I've had to relearn. That things run out. That time passes and takes things with it and doesn't ask your permission first. I've been sitting here for probably 20 minutes just watching the flame. Not thinking about anything important. Just watching it get shorter. A photographer's habit, I guess. Watch the light. Watch it change. Figure out what it's telling you about the thing around it. It's telling me the cabin is cold. Colder than I want it to be. I've got the stove going in the front room, but the bedroom door is cracked, and not all of it makes it back here. Tonight is one of those nights where the cold seeps in from everywhere at once. Through the window glass, through the logs in the wall, up through the floor from the frozen ground underneath. You don't feel it as a single thing. It's more like the room slowly decides it doesn't want to be warm anymore, and there's nothing you can do about it. I've been keeping this log because I didn't know what else to do with myself. In the beginning, I was doing it on the Canon, the big one, the R5, just sitting it on the windowsill and talking to it like it was someone listening. That felt less crazy than it sounds. I've spent most of my adult life talking to a camera, explaining what I'm seeing. Why this angle? Why this light? Why I waited 3 hours on a ridge in -10 degrees to catch a snowy owl landing on a fence post. Talking to a camera is just how I process things, what's in front of me, and what it means. But the battery on the Canon died around day 30, and I can't charge it consistently enough to use it for video anymore. Solar's being finicky, so now I'm talking to this notebook instead. My aunt's notebook, actually. She had about 8 of them in the bottom drawer of her desk. All these small moleskines with black covers, most of them blank. She bought them the way some people buy running shoes. Good intentions, no follow-through. Sorry, Ruth, that's not fair. You had plenty of follow-through in other places. I'll get to Ruth later. I'll get to all of it. But right now the candle is almost out, and I want to get down what today was before I forget the details. Details matter. I've been a photographer for 11 years, and the thing I know better than anything is that the detail is the whole story. The big picture is just context. The detail is what's real. Today, I checked the east trap line, 4 traps total, spaced out along the tree line about 60 meters behind the cabin. 3 of them had snow drifted over them and needed to be reset. The 4th one, the one I baited with the last of the peanut butter crackers, which I know is stupid, but I was desperate, had a snowshoe hair in it. Good size, maybe 4 pounds live weight. I said sorry to it before I did what I had to do, and I know that's a weird thing to write down, but I also know I'd feel worse if I hadn't. I skinned it out there in the cold, because I didn't want blood in the cabin. My hands were numb by the time I was done. I could barely feel the knife. Hare stew tonight with the last 2 potatoes from the bag I found in Ruth's cellar. The potatoes are soft and starting to go. I should have eaten them 2 weeks ago, but I kept putting it off because once those potatoes are gone, that's it. No more potatoes until I figure out something else. I think about that a lot. The figure out something else part. The snow started again around 3 in the afternoon. Light at first, just flurries coming horizontal off the ridge, but by dark it was coming down steady, an inch already on the porch railing by the time I came inside. The forecast on the radio, when the radio works, which is less and less, said something about a system coming in from the northwest. Could be serious. Could be 4 to 6 inches overnight, more tomorrow. I don't hate the snow the way I thought I would. That surprises me. I came up here to photograph snow, after all. The project was supposed to be about mountain winters, the way high-altitude environments look in the deep months, the light quality, the way animals move differently when the cold gets extreme. I had grant money, and 3 months, and a specific plan. The snow was supposed to be my subject, not my problem. Now it's both, and I'm not sure which it is more. Through the window, this north-facing one that looks up toward the ridge, the snow makes everything look like overexposed film. Just white and white and white and the black shapes of the spruce trees pushing up through it. There's something out there tonight. I saw it about an hour ago, just at the edge of the tree line. A shape, standing, not moving the way an animal moves, not shifting its weight or turning its head, just standing there in the falling snow getting covered up. I've learned not to look too long at those shapes. I need to explain how I got here. All of it. Because whoever reads this, if anyone ever does, they're going to want to know. And I want to write it down while I still remember the early parts clearly. Memory is the first thing the cold takes from you. Not heat, not energy. Memory. I've noticed that. The days before all this are starting to feel further away than 42 days should make them feel. So, here it is. My name is Garrett Hale. I'm 34 years old. I'm a wildlife photographer, freelance, which means I spend about half my income on gear, and about half my time on planes, and about all of my relationships watching them end, because the person on the other side of them eventually gets tired of competing with a camera. I've been told I see the world in frames, that I don't experience things so much as I document them. My ex-girlfriend, her name was Diane, she taught kindergarten, she deserved better, told me once that I was the most observant person she'd ever met and the least present. That both things were true at the same time. She was right. I've thought about it a lot up here. I got to Ruth's cabin on the 15th of October, about 6 weeks before everything fell apart, though I didn't know that then. I didn't know anything then. The project was called Altitude in Winter, and it was funded by a nature magazine I'd worked with before, one of the good ones, the kind that still paid real rates and didn't want you to edit your raw files down to nothing. The editor there, a guy named Patrick who wore the same corduroy jacket in every video call, had liked my previous mountain series and wanted more. Something quieter, he'd said. Something about stillness, about what lives in the cold when everything else has left. Ruth's cabin was perfect for it. She'd left it to me when she died 2 years ago. Left it to me specifically, not to my father, not to my cousin Becca who actually came to visit her, not to anyone who might have used it. She left it to me, and I'd been there maybe twice since the estate cleared. I didn't deserve it. I think she knew that and left it to me anyway. Ruth was like that. The cabin sits at about 7,400 feet elevation in the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. The closest town is Ridgecrest, which is about 14 miles down a dirt road that becomes a paved county road for the last 6 miles into town. In October, that road is still passable. By December, it's not. By January, it's a memory. The mountains close up at a certain point in winter, and what's in them stays in them until spring, which is the whole reason Ruth built the place when she did. She wanted to be in them and not of them, if that makes sense. She was a particular kind of person who needed the world to be quieter than it usually was. So was I guess, in my own weird way. I drove up in my truck, a 2019 F-250 with a camper shell on the back, which I used mostly as a mobile gear closet. Had the R5, 2 backup bodies, 6 lenses, about $40,000 worth of glass in that camper shell, plus my personal stuff, some clothes, a sleeping bag rated to 20 below, a small toolkit I carried everywhere, because things always broke at the worst times. Standard photographer in the field kit. I got to the cabin on a Tuesday and spent 2 days cleaning the place out and getting set up. Ruth had left it in decent shape. She was meticulous about certain things. But 2 years of no one there had done its damage. Mouse droppings in the kitchen drawers. A dead bird somewhere in the crawl space that I could smell but never found. The solar panels on the south-facing roof were coated in pine sap and needed scrubbing. The water pump needed priming. Normal stuff. Fixable stuff. The cabin itself, 800 square feet, single story, log construction. Front room with the wood stove, a kitchen along the back wall, 1 bedroom and a bathroom off a short hallway, a covered porch on the south side that faced down the slope toward the tree line, a root cellar, accessible through a hatch in the kitchen floor. Ruth had added a small generator shed off the east side of the cabin, a detached structure, about the size of a large closet, housing the generator and a bunch of propane tanks and a workbench with tools. That generator shed is the reason I'm alive. I didn't know that when I arrived. I didn't know a lot of things. The first 2 weeks were good. Maybe the best 2 weeks I'd had in a long time, if I'm honest. I was up before dawn every morning, out in the dark with the camera, sitting in the cold on a ridge or in the trees, waiting for the light to do what I needed it to do. Got some incredible stuff. A pair of mule deer moving through early morning fog in a meadow below the cabin. A Clark's nutcracker on a dead pine with the ridge behind it. Frost patterns on the underside of a log that looked like lace. The kind of work that made me remember why I did this. The radio station out of Ridgecrest came through fine up there most of the time. Classic rock during the day, news in the evenings. I didn't listen much because I was there to work, and because the news, well, the news in those weeks was the kind you either couldn't stop consuming or had to stop completely. I was in the second camp. There'd been outbreaks of something. They were calling it a hemorrhagic respiratory illness initially. Rapid onset, aggressive progression, coming out of the Pacific Northwest. The reports were confusing. A lot of conflicting numbers. A lot of officials saying, "We're monitoring the situation," which is what officials say when they don't know what they're dealing with but can't say that. I'd heard maybe 4 or 5 of those reports and then turned it off. I was in the mountains to work. Whatever was happening in Portland and Seattle was not my immediate problem. I heard the first weird broadcast on October 26th. I know the date because I wrote it in the margin of a topographic map I was using that day, circled it with a question mark. The station went to an emergency test tone around noon, and then instead of going back to regular programming, a recorded voice came on. It was calm, not panicked, not dramatic, just methodical. It said something about state of emergency protocols in 3 counties in the western part of the state. It said something about avoiding travel if possible. It said something about following guidance from local health authorities. Then it went back to music. Tom Petty, Won't Back Down. I remember finding that funny in a slightly sick way. The universe has a particular sense of humor about what song comes on right after an emergency broadcast. I tried to get more information on my phone, but the signal up there was always garbage. I had 1 bar on a good day, and no bar was the norm. I drove down to the county road that afternoon, parked where I usually got 2 bars, and tried to load some news. What I found was a mess. The kind of mess that happens when multiple things are breaking at once, and no one's narrative is keeping up with the reality. Videos that wouldn't load. Articles that stopped mid-paragraph like the writer had left to go look out the window. Reddit threads where no one agreed on anything but everyone was scared. What I took away from it, whatever was happening, it was spreading faster than the initial reports had suggested. It was past Portland, past Seattle. There were reports from Sacramento, from Boise, from Denver. Something about animal-to-human transmission, and then human-to-human, and then something else entirely, that the articles kept describing in a way that didn't quite make sense. Words like behavioral changes, and aggression, and loss of cognitive function. Words that made it sound like something other than a respiratory illness. I drove back up to the cabin and sat on the porch for a long time looking at the mountains. My aunt's mountains. The ones she spent 30 years looking at. I thought, I should call someone. My father, Diane, Patrick at the magazine. I thought, I should drive down to Ridgecrest and see what people there know. I thought, I should turn on the radio and not turn it off until I understand what's happening. I did none of those things that night. I made dinner, pasta from the dry goods bag I'd brought up, with olive oil and canned tomatoes. And I went to bed, and I told myself that in the morning I'd have a clearer picture and make a decision. The morning came, and the clearer picture was that the road down to Ridgecrest was blocked. Not by snow, by a truck that had gone off the switchback about 3 miles down, a red pickup, nose first into the ravine on the left side, the cab visible from the road. I stopped, and I shouted, and I climbed partway down, and I saw that the truck was empty. No driver, no blood, nothing, just the truck, engine still warm. I should have turned around right then. I should have gone back to the cabin and locked the door, and thought hard about my situation. I drove down anyway, because I needed to know. Ridgecrest on that morning, October 28th, was wrong in a way that I can only describe now, looking back, as photographic. Every element was correct, but the composition was off. Cars were where they shouldn't be. A hardware store window was broken. There was a dog sitting in the middle of Main Street doing nothing, just sitting there like a sphinx, watching nothing. The diner I'd eaten at twice since I arrived had every light on inside, but no one visible through the window. I got out of my truck outside the gas station, a Shell, small, 2 pumps, and the guy who ran it, a heavyset man named Donnie, who'd been friendly with me on my previous stops, was sitting on the ground outside the door, not injured, not sick that I could see, sitting with his back against the wall and his arms on his knees and his eyes pointed at the ground. I said, "Hey Donnie, you okay?" He said, without looking up, "You should go back up." I said, "Go back up where?" He said, "Where you came from. Back up the mountain. Don't stay down here." And then he didn't say anything else. He just went back to looking at the ground. I asked him what was happening, and he said he didn't know exactly, just that something had come through in the night. Something had come through the next town over, which was Paloma, 12 miles east on the county road. People from Paloma were up here now. Some of them weren't. Weren't what? He shook his head. Said he'd already called his daughter and told her to stay in her house. Said he was going to go back inside and lock up. Said I should go back up the mountain. I drove back up. I spent the next 3 days with the radio on, one hand on the volume dial, turning it up when something came through and down when the static got too thick. What I learned, piece by piece, was this. The thing spreading wasn't just a virus in the standard sense. Something was happening to people after infection that went past the respiratory stage. They called it stage 2 in some reports. In stage 2, the fever broke. The patients stopped presenting as sick. And then, they started doing things. Going places. Moving towards sound and movement. And people in ways that weren't normal. Ways that were the word that kept showing up across different sources, different reports. Predatory. Nobody on the radio wanted to say zombie. Not at first. They said, infected individuals exhibiting dangerous behaviors. They said, stage 2 neurological presentation. They said, violent infected. They went around and around the word for 2 days, and then a DJ on a Denver station just said it flat out, during what sounded like a live breakdown. He said, they're zombies. Okay, I'm calling them what they are. They're goddamn zombies. They're dead, and they're moving, and they're biting people, and I don't know what else to call them. The broadcast got cut after that. But by then, I'd gotten the picture. The picture was, don't go back down. October 31st, Halloween. I watched a group of 8 or 9 of them come through the tree line below the cabin. First time I'd seen them in person. I was out with the camera. Old habit. I keep shooting when I should be running. And I photographed them through the 500mm telephoto from the porch. I'll come back to those photographs. They matter, in a way. What I noticed, looking through the lens, they moved wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not like movie monsters, just slightly off. The way a marionette looks almost human but isn't, because the motion originates from the wrong place. They walked toward noise. I'd left the radio on inside with the volume up and they came toward the cabin, slowly, not in a rush, like they had all the time in the world. They had all the time in the world because they didn't know about time anymore. I went inside. I turned the radio off. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and a hunting rifle across my knees. Ruth's rifle, a 30-06 bolt action she'd kept cleaned and oiled and stocked with 3 boxes of ammunition in the closet. And I waited. They circled the cabin twice. I know, because I could hear them on the gravel around the sides. The crunch of the porch steps flexing, someone's hand or face against the window glass. Just pressure, no sound of breath. They weren't smart. That was the thing I noticed first, and held on to like a lifeline. They weren't smart. They moved toward sound and pulled away from silence. That was the rule. That was the only rule. After about 2 hours, they drifted off toward the trees again. I sat in the kitchen until I couldn't hear anything outside, and then I sat there another hour after that. Then I got up and I started thinking about what I needed to do. November. I need to back up slightly to explain one thing about Ruth's cabin that changes everything. Ruth was a woman who planned, not in a paranoid way. She wasn't stockpiling for the apocalypse or anything like that. She planned the way old-fashioned people plan. The ones who grew up where the hardware store was 40 miles away, and you couldn't just order something off the internet and have it tomorrow. You kept things. You maintained things. You thought about what you'd need before you needed it. The root cellar under the kitchen had about 60 pounds of dried beans, a similar quantity of rice, canned goods going back 3 years that were still fine, jerked meat that she'd done herself, pickled vegetables in glass jars, dried herbs, 20 pounds of flour in sealed plastic bins, coffee, salt, sugar, and various other things that would have been a month's grocery run at an actual store. Plus the equipment to use all of it, a manual grain grinder bolted to the wall, a pressure canner on a shelf, mason jars by the hundreds. The generator shed had the generator itself, 4 50-pound bags of generator fuel stabilizer, various hand tools hung on the wall, including 2 saws, an axe, 2 hatchets, drill bits, wrenches, a come-along winch, 3 come-along straps, electrical wire and connectors, a spare battery bank for the solar system, soldering equipment, and a labeled plastic bin that said traps, in Ruth's handwriting, containing 8 spring-loaded foothold traps and 6 snares and a coil of steel wire. I didn't know about the traps bin for the first week. I found it when I was reorganizing the shed. When I found it, I sat down on the workbench stool, and I pressed my hands together between my knees, and I thought, Ruth, what did you know that I didn't know you knew? Her hunting license had been renewed in September, 2 months before her cabin would be occupied by someone else. I still think about that. The first 2 weeks of November were fortification. That's the word I keep coming back to, though it doesn't quite capture what it felt like. What it felt like was, I worked until I couldn't think about anything except what I was working on, and that was good, because when I wasn't working I was thinking about my father in Denver and whether he was okay, and about Diane in Fort Collins, which was closer to the initial reports, and about Patrick in his corduroy jacket, and whether that whole world, the world of photo assignments and editorial meetings and arguing about white balance, had just ceased to exist. It probably had. It probably had, and I was going to have to get used to that. So I worked. Storm shutters. The cabin had them on all the windows. Old wooden shutters on iron hinges that folded out from the wall and latched from inside. I'd never given them much thought before. Now I cleaned the hardware with oil, tested every latch, found 2 with broken latches, and replaced them with new eye bolts and carabiners from Ruth's tool bin. With all the shutters closed, the windows were protected by a solid 1.5 inches of hardwood, not impenetrable, but enough. The front door was solid, which helped. 2-inch pine door with a dead bolt. I added a bar lock, a length of heavy steel pipe from the shed that I fitted into brackets I made from bent rebar. The bar dropped into the brackets and wouldn't come out without lifting it from inside. Nothing was getting through that door from the outside without significant effort and significant noise. And significant noise was not something they seemed capable of organizing. Back door was weaker, hollow core with a standard knob lock. I replaced it with a proper deadbolt from a spare lock set I found in the shed. Apparently Ruth had bought it and never installed it, which I added to my ongoing list of things Ruth had apparently anticipated, and then framed the door with a piece of angle iron I bolted to the wall on both sides. Not perfect, but much better. The porch. This one took more thought. The porch was the exposed side, south-facing, open, wood railings. Nice in October. Problem in November. I pulled the railings off. They were just screwed into the deck boards, and stacked them inside the generator shed. Then I took 4 8-foot sections of galvanized welded wire fence I found rolled up under the shed floor, and stretched them across the porch opening, anchoring them to the log walls with lag screws. It wasn't a wall, but it was an obstacle. And obstacles mattered. The window I was most worried about was the north-facing bedroom window, because it was low. The outside grade came up close to it, so the sill was only about 1.5 feet off the ground on the exterior side. I made a simple board and spike barrier for outside the window, drove the stakes into the frozen ground with the back of the axe, kept it about 18 inches from the wall, so it wasn't touching, but anything coming toward the window would walk into it first. Later, much later, I'd improve on that. Food rationing. I sat down with the cellar inventory on November 5th and worked out the math. The beans and rice, assuming 2 modest meals a day, would last me about 4 months without supplementation. The canned goods added another month in rough calories. The jerked meat was high calorie and dense, another 2 or 3 weeks if stretched. The flour could make bread, and bread could make things go further. So I had maybe 6 months of food if I was careful, and supplemented nothing. I needed to be here longer than 6 months. I knew that already. The state of things outside wasn't the kind of thing that resolved in 6 months. So the trapping and hunting that I'd been romanticizing in my head as optional became immediately necessary. And the good news was, I had the equipment, and the bad news was, I had no idea how to use it. I figured it out. That's the short version. The long version involves a week of botched traps, 2 hairs that got loose before I could close, learning that animals follow the same paths every day, if you're patient enough to find the paths, and a lot of sitting in the cold watching the tree line and thinking about Diane's face the last time I saw her, and whether she'd be alive now if I'd been, I don't know. Less what I am, more what she needed. But I figured it out. The snares were more consistent than the foothold traps in the early days. The foothold traps required a set trigger pressure, and I kept setting them too light or too heavy. The snares were simpler. Wire loop on a branch, right height, right diameter, right location on the animal's path. Ruth had a book in the bedroom, a small paperback with a green cover, Wilderness Survival Skills for the Serious Outdoorsman. I'd seen it before and never opened it. Now I read it like scripture. November 12th, first real snowfall. Not the first snow. There'd been flurries all month, but the first accumulation, 8 inches overnight, which brought everything outside to a kind of hushed completeness. I stood on the porch in the morning and looked out at it, and for about 30 seconds I forgot everything and just saw it as a photograph. The quality of light on new snow in the early morning. That gray-blue pre-sun light that makes everything look like it's made of the same substance. The spruce trees weighted down, their branches curved. A single track across the open space below the porch, probably a fox, by the gait pattern. Then I remembered, and went inside, and started thinking about what 8 inches of snow meant for my situation. It meant the road was done. I already knew the road was probably done in the social collapse sense, but now it was done in the physical sense too, which meant no one was coming up here. For good or bad, no one was coming. I was here until the road cleared in spring, and spring was about 5 months away. Okay, I thought. Okay then. Over the following weeks I settled into the first version of my routine. This changed as the winter got more serious, but the basic shape of it held. Up before dawn, check the trap lines. Back before full light, eat something small, work on whatever needed working on that day, eat again at midday, do the more intensive tasks in the afternoon when the light was best, through the shuttered windows. Check outside at dusk from the second-story loft. The cabin didn't have a true second story, but it had a sleeping loft accessible by ladder, with a window that gave a decent elevated view, locked down for the night by dark. I kept the radio on for 2 hours each night, between 7 and 9. At first it gave me news, then it gave me emergency information. Then it gave me 2 competing signal types. An official broadcast that repeated the same message about shelter in place and emergency services that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality, and the unofficial broadcasts that kept coming on other frequencies. Voices I couldn't identify, people talking about what they were seeing in different cities, different places. Around November 20th, the official broadcast stopped. After that, it was just the unofficial ones, and they were getting harder to find and harder to hold on to. The signal kept breaking up. Some nights there was nothing. The silence on the radio was worse than bad news. Bad news at least tells you someone's still out there making broadcasts. Silence tells you nothing. December. The first strange thing happened on December 3rd. I'm being specific about the date because I wrote it down and circled it and put a question mark next to it, just like I did with the first weird broadcast. I was developing a habit of noting the unexplainable. I was resetting a snare about 40 meters into the tree line, a spot where I'd been catching hares consistently, right at the edge of a small meadow where they liked to come out in early morning. Snow was about 14 inches deep by this point, and I'd learned to pack a trail to the trap lines using snowshoes I'd found in the generator shed, also apparently pre-positioned by Ruth because of course they were. The snowshoes were old, wood and leather, but functional. I was crouching to reset the snare, and I looked up because I heard something. Not a big sound, a small sound actually, like something running across the snow at the far edge of the meadow. Small feet, fast. I froze, because that's what you do when you hear something you're not expecting. Then I saw the tracks. A set of small footprints crossed the meadow from the south edge to the north edge, coming out of the spruce on one side and disappearing into the spruce on the other. Small prints. The shape wasn't animal. The shape was a child's boot, a small one, probably a 6 or a 7, with a tread pattern visible in the fresh snow. Toe in front, heel behind. 2 feet. 2 human feet, probably belonging to a child of maybe 6 or 7 years. The tracks were fresh. They steamed slightly in the cold air. Whatever made them had been there in the last 10 minutes. I stood up, and I looked at the trees on the north side of the meadow, and I said, "Hello." I said, "Is someone there?" I said, "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." The trees said nothing back. I followed the tracks to the north edge of the meadow, and they stopped at the spruce line. Not in the sense that they ended at the edge of the trees. They ended, period. The snow under the first trees was undisturbed. The prints came to the edge of the tree line and stopped, without any indication of what happened next. No scuffing, no slide marks, no other tracks. They just stopped. I spent probably 20 minutes looking. I went into the trees on both sides and back, and couldn't find any continuation. I went back to the meadow and looked at the prints again, in case I was misreading them, in case they were animal prints, in some shape I'd misidentified. They weren't. They were a child's boot prints. I went back to the cabin and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I went back out and photographed the prints with the Canon before the battery died. I don't know what made those tracks. I have never found an explanation that satisfies me. I've tried. I've thought about it at 3 in the morning for months now, and I have no answer. Let me tell you what I do know about the infected, because this is relevant to why those prints were strange. They don't run. The infected walk. They shamble, shuffle, move at a brisk walking pace at their fastest. They don't sprint. They're not fast. The reason you can keep distance from them on flat ground is because you are faster. On snow and ice, where footing is bad for everyone, the difference gets smaller, but they still don't run. They certainly don't run at the speed those prints suggested. The stride length was too long for the foot size, which means whatever made them was going fast. Running or skipping or something between. Children don't survive alone in the mountains in December. Not up here, not at this elevation, not without food and shelter and someone keeping them alive. So what made those tracks? I cannot tell you. I lay awake that night listening to the wind come off the ridge, and I thought about it until my brain started doing that thing where the same thought loops and goes nowhere, and eventually, I made myself stop. Some things up here don't have answers. I'm learning to leave room for that. December went on. The cold got more serious. Not that it hadn't been cold before. It had been below freezing every night since the first week of November. But there's a difference between cold and mountain winter cold. Mountain winter cold is a different category of thing. It has weight to it. It presses down on you from above and comes up through the floor and finds the gap between your collar and your neck and sits there. At night, the temperature outside was dropping to -15, sometimes -20. The stove ran all night and kept the front room livable and the bedroom borderline. I started sleeping in the front room with the stove, dragging the mattress out of the bedroom and laying it on the floor near the stove. It was undignified and fine. Fuel for the stove was the constant problem. The woodpile along the east wall of the cabin was Ruth's contribution. She'd had it cut and stacked in September, which meant the wood was reasonably seasoned and burned well. I estimated about 2 cords when I arrived. At the rate I was burning it, maybe until February. After that, I'd have to cut more, which meant going into the trees with the axe and the handsaw and falling deadwood. I practiced this in December while the pile was still adequate, because falling a tree alone with a handsaw is a skill that takes practice, And I needed to be proficient before I needed to be proficient. I got better at it. Not good, but better. The first tree I took down took me 4 hours. The third one took me 90 minutes. The trap lines kept giving me hares, occasionally a squirrel, once a grouse that had gotten its leg caught in a snare and was sitting there looking furious when I arrived. I learned which parts of the animals had the most calories, which I wouldn't have thought to calculate before, but now calculated carefully. Liver and organs first because they didn't keep. Muscle meat next. Bones for broth. Ruth had a big stockpot and I used it constantly, boiling bones for hours and getting every possible calorie out of them. I was losing weight. Not dramatically, not in a way that alarmed me yet, but my belt had moved 2 notches and my face in the bathroom mirror looked narrower than I was used to seeing. I was burning more than I was taking in, slightly, and the cold made it worse, because your body uses more calories just maintaining temperature when the ambient is -15. I added a 4th meal, a small one, before bed, usually just a bowl of broth or a few crackers from a box I rationed strictly. It helped. December 18th or 19th. I'm less certain on this one. I heard what I'm going to call the argument. From outside, from down the slope somewhere below the porch, 2 voices, both male, both elevated. Not the sounds the infected made. The infected were mostly quiet, which was one of their specific horrors. They moved through silence and didn't announce themselves. These were human voices, arguing. I couldn't make out the words because the wind was wrong that night, but I could hear the tone, accusatory from one side, defensive from the other, then silence. I had the rifle. I stood at the north window and looked through the crack between the shutter and the frame, which gave me a narrow slice of the outside. I couldn't see anything in the dark and the falling snow. The voices didn't come back. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what happened to them. Christmas. I know this sounds like a small thing to mention, but I want to mention it, because it was a day that felt specifically hard, in a way that was separate from the practical problems. Not because I was religious about Christmas. I wasn't, not especially. But because Christmas was the clearest marker of time in the whole year. The most obvious point at which you said, this is where we are, this is who we're with, this is what we've built. And on this Christmas I was alone in a dead woman's cabin on a mountain with about 5 months of food left, talking to a notebook because my camera was dead and the world below me had become something I didn't recognize. I found a box of Christmas tree lights in the storage room, battery-powered, the kind you hang on a small indoor tree. Ruth apparently bought them at some point and never opened them. I ran them around the window frame in the front room and turned them on for about 2 hours on the evening of December 25th. They were colored, blue and green and yellow and red, those small old-fashioned bulbs. They made the shuttered window look like a stained glass memory of something. I ate a good dinner that night, full portions, opened a can of green beans and a can of peaches, and cooked a hare I'd caught that morning. Made proper bread, Ruth's recipe, written on an index card stuck to the inside of a cabinet door. Flour, salt, baking powder, water, a little oil, 30 minutes in the cast iron on the stovetop covered. It came out dense but good. And then I sat in the front room with those lights going, and I talked to Ruth for a while. Out loud. Told her what was happening. Asked her some questions about the traps and the solar, and what she'd known, and when she'd known it. She didn't answer, obviously, because she was dead, and had been dead for 2 years. But it helped to talk. I talked to Diane too, for a little while. That was harder. That was the kind of conversation you have when you know you're probably never going to have the actual conversation. I hope she's okay. I hope she made it somewhere safe. I hope she found someone who stayed in the frame instead of behind the camera. January was the hardest month. I want to be clear about that. Later months were longer and stranger, and had more things happen in them. But January was the hardest, because it was the month I almost died twice, and the month the solar system failed, and the month I understood that survival was not a thing you achieved and then had. It was a thing you did continuously, every day, with no days off and no guarantees. January 4th. I fell through the ice. There was a frozen pond about 300 meters east of the cabin, slightly downhill. I'd been using it as a landmark and nothing else. On January 4th, I decided to test whether it was solid enough to walk on, because in the back of my head, I was thinking about ice fishing, which seemed like a more reliable food source than the trap lines. The ice on the edge was about 4 inches. Solid. Good. I walked out from the bank maybe 15 feet, and then I was suddenly chest deep in black water. I have never in my life experienced cold like that. It's not like the cold in the air, which is bad enough. It's like being plugged into an electrical socket, except instead of electricity, it's just wrongness. Every cell in your body suddenly going, "This is wrong. Stop this immediately." I got out. I don't know exactly how, because the memory compresses the moment. My hands were on the ice, and the ice was keeping breaking, and then they were on ice that held, and I was dragging myself out on my belly, and then I was standing on the bank, and my clothes were making a sound like crackling plastic as they started to freeze. I ran. I have never run so hard in my life, and running in snowshoes is not graceful, but I ran the 300 meters back to the cabin at full speed, and I got inside, and got the stove going, and stripped everything off, and sat directly in front of it, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, and shook for about an hour. I didn't die of hypothermia. This is less because of anything I did, and more because the cabin was already warm, the stove caught fast, and the blankets were thick. If any one of those things had been different, colder cabin, slow stove, thin blankets, I would have died. I was close enough to it to smell it. Hypothermia smells like a certain kind of fog inside your own head, like your thoughts are getting slow and heavy, and you could just let them. I didn't let them. January 11th, the solar system. The cabin's solar setup was Ruth's addition, installed about 4 years before she died. 3 panels on the south roof, a charge controller, a battery bank of 4 deep cycle batteries in the crawl space, and a 1,000-watt inverter. It ran the lights, the radio, a small chest freezer she used for storing meat, and various small appliances. It was the whole reason the cabin felt livable in modern terms. On January 11th, I noticed the battery bank voltage was low. Not critically low, but lower than it should have been, given the past week's sunny weather. I checked the panels. They were clear of snow, which I'd been meticulous about, and the charge controller and the wiring into the crawl space, and everything looked fine. I ran a load test on the batteries with a multimeter I found in the shed, and found that 2 of the 4 batteries had significantly reduced capacity. They were old, probably the original batteries from when the system was installed, and they'd been running all winter, and they were failing. A failing battery bank meant the system charged during the day and discharged below useful voltage by midnight, which meant no lights after midnight, and more critically, no radio after midnight, and more critically still, no chest freezer. I thought about the chest freezer for a long time before I admitted what I had to do. The freezer used about 40 watts constantly, 24 hours a day. That was most of the low-capacity battery bank's storage. If I turned off the freezer, the battery bank would have enough overhead to run the radio and the lights through the night. But if I turned off the freezer, the meat I had stored there would thaw. Some of it I'd been saving, accumulating slowly over 2 months. A good-sized squirrel, parts of 3 hares, a chunk of elk that I'd found in the freezer when I arrived, left by Ruth, that I'd been carefully rationing. Outside was -20. I thought about that for a moment, and then I went and got a cooler, a big one, blue plastic, the type you bring to a tailgate, and I put all the freezer contents in the cooler, and I carried it out to the generator shed, and I hung it from a rafter hook so nothing could get to it. The generator shed was essentially the same temperature as outside. -20 kept things frozen just as well as a freezer, and cost 0 battery capacity. Problem solved. But it was the kind of problem solving that made me feel how narrow my margins were. Everything I had was being used, and there wasn't a lot of redundancy. When things failed, I needed to improvise fast and get it right, because I didn't have the resources to be wrong. The 2 bad batteries I replaced, not with new batteries, which I obviously didn't have, but with a creative series connection of 6 small 12-volt AGM batteries I found in the generator shed. Ruth had apparently had them for the generator. For some reason I never worked out. They were smaller capacity than the deep cycle batteries, but in series, they gave me enough storage to get through a winter night on a reduced load. I spent 2 days rewiring the battery bank with the soldering equipment from the shed. I burned my finger on the iron 3 times and shorted the circuit once and got a spark that made me say some things I won't write down, but eventually it worked. When the lights came on at 7 in the evening, and I knew they'd stay on until I turned them off, I sat in the front room and I cried for about 90 seconds. Not dramatically, just that thing where your eyes go wet because the tension breaks and your body takes the chance to let something out. Then I made dinner and moved on. February. By February, I'd been alone on the mountain for over 3 months. I want to describe what that does to you, as accurately as I can, because it's not what I expected. I expected to get lonely. I did get lonely, but not in the sharp social way I'd have predicted before. It was more like a slow hollowing, a gradual reduction in the sense that your thoughts needed an audience. You started talking to yourself not because you were lonely, but because your thoughts needed to go somewhere, needed to leave the inside of your head and exist in the air, and there was no one else to put them in front of. So you talked to the stove, you talked to the trap lines, you talked to your dead aunt. The photographs I'd taken before the battery died on the Canon, I looked at them on a small laptop that I could charge via the solar system. The project photographs, the ones I'd come up here to take. The mule deer in the fog, the nutcracker on the pine, the frost patterns. I looked at them because they were proof that the world had been beautiful recently, and because beauty, even remembered, is better than the absence of it. And then I found the photographs I'd taken of the infected group in late October, the group that came through the tree line on Halloween. I'd almost forgotten them and everything that followed. I went through them carefully, full resolution, zoomed in. 8 individuals, all adults, based on size, various clothing, some in outdoor gear, some in casual clothes, one in what looked like hospital scrubs. No one I recognized. They moved in loose proximity to each other without any sign of coordination or communication. They weren't a group in any organized sense. They just happened to be moving in the same direction, toward the sound of my radio. What I noticed looking at these photographs carefully, a photographer's careful looking, their skin was off, not decomposing, not the dramatic rotting flesh thing from movies, just discolored, a grayness, particularly around the face, the hands, like something about the circulation had gone wrong. Their eyes in the photos, the ones facing the right direction, looked white, not fully, not white, just filmed over. The woman in the hospital scrubs was the one facing the camera most directly. She was maybe 40, maybe 45, brown hair loose around her face, the scrubs dirty but not torn. She looked like someone who had recently been a completely normal person, a nurse or a lab tech or a hospital administrator. She looked like someone who would have had opinions about things and lunch plans and a parking spot with her name on the sign. I looked at her face in the photograph for a long time. I kept thinking about the moment the picture was taken. She'd been looking toward the cabin, toward the sound, and I'd framed the shot and held my breath and pressed the shutter, and she'd had no idea I was there, and I'd had no idea what she'd been. Not yet, not really. I closed the laptop. The middle of February brought the Ranger outpost. This is a thing I need to talk about carefully. The Pinos National Forest Ranger Outpost was a small building about 4.5 miles north of the cabin, up a service road that the Rangers used in summer. I'd known it was there because it showed on the topographic map, and because I'd seen the sign for the service road on my drive up in October. In October, I'd thought nothing of it. In February, I thought about it constantly. Ranger outposts were stocked. Not extensively, but practically. Basic first aid, emergency rations, fuel for snow machines, communication equipment. Standard Forest Service protocol was to keep outposts supplied enough for a 2-person crew to shelter in place for 72 hours. My food math by February was getting tighter than I wanted, and I was down to 1 battery of charged candles, and my medical kit was just a first aid box with a bag of bandages and some ibuprofen. I needed to go. I knew I needed to go. The question was how to do it safely. 4.5 miles on snowshoes was doable. I'd been doing 4-mile circuits on the trap lines. The elevation was higher, which meant harder going, but the service road was marked, and once I found it, the path would be clear. The risk was 4.5 miles is 4.5 miles out, and 4.5 miles back, which is 9 miles total, which is a full day in winter conditions. A full day outside, away from the cabin, in a landscape I didn't fully know, with infected potentially anywhere in the trees. What I'd learned about the infected in the cold, they slowed down, not dramatically, not to the point of being harmless, but the genuine -20 nights seemed to reduce their activity. They'd cluster in areas with some shelter from the wind, buildings or dense tree stands, and they didn't range as actively. On days when the temperature came up to 0 or above, they moved more. Something about their body temperature, probably, which wasn't really their body temperature anymore, but whatever the infection used to keep them functional. I waited for a cold spell. I planned the route. I packed a day pack with the minimum, water bottle in my inner pocket so it wouldn't freeze, a handful of granola bars, the rifle, 50 rounds in my breast pocket where they'd stay warm and feed reliably, the multi-tool, a folded emergency space blanket, the headlamp, and a compass. February 23rd, -7 degrees, clear sky, no wind, good visibility. I left at 6 in the morning and found the service road by 7 and reached the ranger outpost by 9:30. The outpost was a 12 by 16 log structure with a metal roof. The door was unlocked, standard practice, so stranded hikers could shelter, and when I pushed it open, it swung into darkness, and something smelled wrong. I stood in the doorway for probably 30 seconds, just standing there, letting my eyes adjust, breathing through my mouth because the smell coming out was the particular smell of something that had been wrong in a closed space for a long time, not fresh bad, old bad. The man inside had been there since at least November, based on the state of things. He was in a sleeping bag on the cot along the far wall, his face turned toward the wall, his position so completely still and so completely finished that there was no part of me that hoped or even wondered. He was gone. He'd been gone a while. He wasn't infected. He wasn't a zombie. His hands were human-colored, and his face, when I made myself go look, was human. He'd died of something else. His sleeping bag was dirty, around where a wound might have been. His right side, hip area. I didn't look too closely. He might have come here injured and not made it. He might have been sick. He might have just given up, which was also a thing that happened, which was one of the things I thought about on bad nights, the decision not to keep going. On the table next to the cot, there was a radio, the kind rangers used, a Motorola handheld, dead battery but undamaged. I took it. There was also a small notebook, personal journal, not official log, and I put it in my pack without reading it, because reading it there felt wrong, too close to the body, too much like I was taking something private from someone who couldn't say no anymore. I read it later, back at the cabin, over the course of 2 evenings. His name was Danny. He was 23 years old. He'd come up to the outpost after leaving his ranger station 20 miles south because the station had been overrun and he was the only one who got out. He'd been living at the outpost for about 3 weeks before his notes stopped. The last entry said, "Wound infected." Not the other kind, just a regular infection, which before October would have meant a doctor and antibiotics and a week of rest. Now it meant this. He'd been 23 years old. I found the emergency rations, 6 meal packs designed for 3 days of 2-person use, so about 42 meals total. I found 2 gallons of water treatment tablets. I found a first aid kit that made mine look like a Band-Aid collection, proper antiseptic, suture kit, a SAM splint, burn dressings, 3 full rolls of gauze, a blood pressure cuff, and 2 auto-injector epinephrine pens. I found 2 cans of white gas for a camp stove. I found a map of the local terrain, marked with hand notations in what I assumed was Danny's handwriting, showing animal trails, water sources, and one notation that said, "Cache," and pointed to a spot about 1.5 miles from where I was standing. I took everything, all of it. Loaded my pack until my shoulders ached and my knees complained on the way back. I loaded everything except for Danny and his sleeping bag, which I left because I had no way to deal with that, and the cold would keep. Walking back, 9 miles in cold that settled into my chest and stayed there. I thought about Danny for most of it. 23. A scratch or a cut or whatever happened, out here, where there was nothing to treat it with. Just the wrong kind of luck at the wrong kind of time. I got back to the cabin at 3 in the afternoon, started the stove, made tea from some dried chamomile I'd found in the kitchen, and sat with the warmth coming into my chest and thought about what luck was. I visited the cache location the following week. It was a metal lockbox buried under a flat rock, and inside it were 2 boxes of 12-gauge shotgun shells, a folded waterproof tarp, a fire-starting kit, a hand-crank emergency radio, and a Ziploc bag containing 6 foil-wrapped energy bars and a handwritten note that said, "I hope you found this when you needed it." Signed, D.H. D.H. Danny. He'd put this there himself. He'd buried this himself. This small stash of useful things, in case someone else needed them later, in case he didn't make it. I sat in the snow next to the open lockbox for probably 5 minutes. Then I closed it back up, except for the hand-crank radio, which I needed immediately. Left the other things in place. I'd come back for them when I needed them. I went back to the cabin, and I charged the hand-crank radio by cranking it for 30 minutes, and when the signal came through, it was distant and scratchy, but real, a voice coming across a frequency I hadn't tried before. A man reading a list of towns. Just a list, nothing else, no explanation. Just a calm voice reading town names, Colorado towns mostly, some in New Mexico. After each town, a pause, and then a word, either confirmed or lost. Ridgecrest was lost. I sat and listened to the whole list before I turned it off. March. March brought a change in the quality of light that I noticed before anything else, because I was a photographer, and light is what I speak natively. It wasn't warmer. It was still bitterly cold, still below zero most nights, but the sun stayed up longer and sat higher, and the quality of it coming through the spruce trees in the afternoon was different, more direct. The shadows got sharper. I noticed this, and it did something to me that I hadn't expected. It made me feel something like hope, which was the emotion I'd been most carefully managing since October, because hope is expensive up here. Hope makes you do things. Hope makes you take risks, because you think the risk is worth the upside. But the light was different, and the light was telling me something. I was in a state, in March, that I can only describe accurately as a kind of functional strangeness. Not crazy, not detached from reality, just recalibrated. My relationship to time had changed. A day was now an extremely specific unit of things accomplished and not accomplished, not a background thing that passed while you did other things. I counted everything. Calories consumed, wood burned, traps checked, rounds of ammunition accounted for. I cleaned the rifle every 4 days whether it needed it or not because it was something to do, and because a dirty rifle in the wrong moment was a thing I couldn't afford. I'd started eating better, more meat, more variety in the traps. In March, the animals were ranging more as the days lengthened, and I caught a fat grouse and a small rabbit within the same week, which felt like abundance. I found a place, about half a mile south along the ridge, where deer came every few days to paw through the snow for dry grass. I spent 2 mornings lying in the snow, watching them through the telephoto. Still in the camera, still some charge left, though I was hoarding it. And on the 3rd morning I shot one. The 30-06 was Ruth's rifle, and it was sighted in for someone shorter than me, which I didn't account for the first time I tried to shoot anything, and missed spectacularly. But I adjusted, and the deer on the 3rd morning, a doe at about 80 meters, dropped clean. The problem with a deer is that it's a lot of meat. A lot of meat is a problem? Yes. A deer, cleaned and processed, was more protein than I could go through before spoilage became an issue, even in the cold. I spent an entire day processing it, hanging it from the rafters of the generator shed, butchering it with the kitchen knives in a way that Ruth would have done much better and faster, wrapping portions in plastic from a roll I'd found in the shed, hanging them where the temperature was consistent. I ate well for 3 weeks. It changed things. Caloric adequacy changes your thinking, your energy, your ability to problem solve. I hadn't realized how much the slight deficit had been slowing me down until I wasn't in deficit anymore. I also found out in March what the generator was actually for. I'd used it sparingly, twice, for specific tasks where the solar didn't have enough capacity and I needed power quickly. The fuel consumption was too high for regular use. But going through the shed thoroughly in early March, looking for things I might have missed, I found a compartment in the workbench top that lifted up to reveal a small space underneath, and in the space, a handwritten operations manual for the whole cabin system, a binder with laminated pages, Ruth's handwriting throughout. Her careful, precise handwriting that slanted slightly right and never wasted space. The manual described the solar system, the generator, the water pump, the root cellar temperature management system. Apparently there was a simple vent mechanism that kept the root cellar at an even temperature in winter, which I'd completely overlooked, and which was why the food down there had kept better than I'd expected. It described the antenna array on the roof. I'd assumed this was just for the radio, but according to the manual, it was configured to also receive weather satellite transmissions if you had the right receiver, which was apparently in the storage room in a box labeled Weather Instruments. I found the box. Inside, a small dedicated weather satellite receiver that Ruth had apparently bought specifically for life up here. It was several years old, but functional, and after spending half a day with the manual and some trial and error, I got it working. It didn't give me news or communication. It gave me weather data, satellite imagery, temperature maps, precipitation forecasts, which, as it turned out, was enormously useful. But the last page of the binder had something that wasn't about the cabin systems. It was a letter, written to me, in Ruth's handwriting. And it started with my name, Garrett. If you're reading this, you're at the cabin and I'm not there anymore, which means my gamble paid off, or didn't, depending on your perspective. I want to explain some things. I knew something was coming. Not specifically. I'm not a prophet and I'm not paranoid in the way you might be thinking right now. But I worked for 31 years as an epidemiologist, and the data I was looking at in the last year of my life suggested that the strain patterns coming out of certain wildlife reservoirs in the Pacific Northwest were worth worrying about very seriously. I wasn't the only one who thought so. Some of us pushed hard to get taken seriously, and were not. That happens. You do what you can, and then you do what you can prepare for. I left you the cabin because you were the one person in the family who already knew how to be alone in high places. Everyone else would have tried to leave too early and ended up in the wrong place. You would have stayed. I counted on that. The things I left for you are not accidents. The rifle is sighted to 80 meters and 120 meters on the adjustable rear sight. The trap set is full complement for a one-person operation. The root cellar is enough food for 6 months of careful eating. The manual has everything else. There is one other thing. In the storage room, behind the weather instrument box, there is a gray Pelican case with a combination lock. The combination is your birth year backwards. Inside is a satellite phone and a list of contacts. Some of them are researchers I worked with. I don't know if any of them are still reachable, but try. I love you, and I'm sorry I never said it enough when I could have. You were always my favorite, and I should have told you. Ruth. I read this letter 4 times. Then I went and found the Pelican case. She'd left me a satellite phone. I sat on the floor of the storage room holding it. The battery was dead, not depleted, just from sitting, the self-discharge over 2 years. I put it on the solar charger and left it for 24 hours, and then I tried to turn it on. It turned on. I sat there, staring at the screen for probably 10 minutes. The network it wanted to connect to was partially down. Not completely. Satellite networks are robust things, distributed, designed for disaster scenarios. But partially. Some of the coverage I needed for the contacts in Ruth's list was spotty. I tried the first number. Dead tone. Number not in service. Second number. Same. Third number. A connect tone. Then static. Then a recording. In a woman's voice that was clear and clipped and professional, The recording said, "This is the Pine Valley Emergency Research Station automated response. We are currently maintaining a limited broadcast schedule. If you are calling from a personal sat phone, please leave your location data and your name on this frequency, and we will attempt to contact you during our next transmission window. Thank you." I left my name. I left the cabin's GPS coordinates. I said I was alive and in good health, and had been at the location since October. I said I had communication capability and enough supplies for an extended period. I said Ruth Hale had been my aunt and had worked in epidemiology. Then I turned the phone off and charged it back up, and sat very still for a long time, thinking about the word response. Someone was still running that station. Someone had set up an automated response. Someone was alive and organized and answering calls. April. The phone was the thing, and waiting for the phone was the thing, and the hardest part of April was the waiting. I kept to my routines with even more discipline than before, because routine was the thing that kept you from spending all day sitting next to the phone and going slowly out of your mind. I had not heard anything back. Every 3 days I called the station number. Every time, the same recording. "Leave your location. We'll contact you." Meanwhile, outside, the mountain was doing something I hadn't seen from this elevation before. The first stage of snowmelt. Not the melt. Not yet. It was still too cold. Still -10 at night. But the settling. The snowpack was compacting under its own weight and under the slightly longer days, and the surface had changed from the loose, dry powder of January to a harder, crustier surface that held your weight better, but reflected the sun with a blinding intensity. I went out more. The days were getting long enough that I could do longer trips and be back before dark. I started exploring methodically, a grid pattern radiating from the cabin, taking the Canon when I had the battery charged. I'd been charging it specifically for documentation purposes now. Less photography for art and more photography for records. Photographing the terrain, the access routes, anything useful. What I found: 3 other structures within 2 miles of the cabin. One was a summer tent platform that was obviously not year-round. One was a hunting blind, very old, basically a pile of logs around a cleared area. The third one was interesting. Another small outbuilding, not on any map I had, built into the hillside so it was partially underground. From the outside it looked like a root cellar. When I pried the door open, took 20 minutes with a crowbar from the shed, it was a root cellar. An old one, predating the cabin. Probably from some earlier structure that had been on this land. Inside, nothing perishable, nothing recent. Some rusted canning equipment. A wooden crate with a broken side. And, on a shelf, a row of 9 glass mason jars sealed with wax over the metal lids. Inside the jars, some kind of jam or preserve. The seal on the wax looked intact. No dates on the jars. I took one jar back to the cabin, opened it carefully, smelled it. Fruit, something sharp and sweet. Tasted the smallest amount on the tip of my finger. Strawberry, old and slightly fermented, but not bad, not making me sick. I went back and got the other 8 jars. On my way back from the root cellar, carrying the jars in a bag, I heard something in the trees to the east. A sound I'd never heard before from that direction. Not a voice, not an animal I recognized, but a rhythmic sound. A knocking, regular interval, knock, pause, knock, pause, like someone knocking on wood. I stopped, listened for about 3 minutes. The knocking continued, same interval, then stopped. I had the rifle. I went east slowly, along the tree line, toward where I thought the sound had come from. The snow was crusty enough that I made noise with every step, which I didn't love. I stopped every few meters and listened. I found the source after about 15 minutes. 2 dead spruce trees leaning against each other at their crowns, and the wind moving through the valley was catching them in a particular way and making them rub against each other. The bark-to-bark contact was what made the knocking. Just trees. I laughed at myself, out loud, in the woods alone, and the laugh echoed off the slope above me and came back sounding like someone else's laugh. I had become very good at finding non-threatening explanations for things. Sometimes they were real, and sometimes I think I talked myself into them. April 15th, approximately day 183. The satellite phone rang. This was not expected. I'd been calling out. I hadn't thought about incoming calls. The ring was a simple digital tone, not loud, and I had the phone sitting on the kitchen table, and when it rang, I knocked over my cup of coffee and said a word I won't write down, and grabbed the phone and answered it. The voice was a woman's voice, clear, without much warmth, the tone of someone accustomed to efficient communication. She said, "Is this the caller from coordinates north 37.4, west 107.6, approximate?" I said yes. Yes, it was. She said she was calling from the Pine Valley Emergency Research Station, and she asked if I was truly okay, nutritionally and medically, and I said yes to both. She said that the station was operational with a crew of 9 and was monitoring the situation in the broader region. She said they'd received over 40 calls from this phone number's network cluster in the past 6 months, and that I was the 20th caller who was still alive and responding. 20 out of 40. She said her name was Dr. Celeste Rourke. She asked if I had a supply of the satellite phone network codes or if I'd been calling raw. I said raw, meaning no access codes. She said she'd transmit me a network code that would improve the call quality and allow two-way data on the satellite channel. Then she said, "You mentioned Ruth Hale. How did you know Dr. Hale?" I said she was my aunt. A pause. Then, she was one of our advisors. She contributed significantly to our initial emergency planning. I'm glad someone she cared about is in a good position. She said they would call again in a week with more information. She said the situation in the lowland areas was, she paused on this word, difficult. She said she'd give me a more complete picture on the follow-up call. I said okay and thank you, and she ended the call. I sat at the table with the phone in my hands and the spilled coffee soaking into the wood of the table, and I thought about Ruth. I thought about my aunt writing epidemiology reports that people ignored, and buying canning jars, and maintaining a rifle and stocking a root cellar, and writing me a letter in her careful slanted handwriting, and leaving me a satellite phone in a locked Pelican case behind a box of weather instruments. She'd planned for this. She'd planned for all of this, and she'd been right, and she was dead, and I was alive in her cabin on her mountain, because she'd known, and planned, and left me everything I needed. I said, out loud, to the ceiling, "You should have told me while you were alive, Ruth." But I already knew why she hadn't. I thought about it for a minute, and knew. Because telling me while she was alive would have required me to believe her, and I wouldn't have. I would have done what people always did when someone told them something they didn't want to hear. I would have nodded, and changed the subject, and driven home, and never thought about it again, until it was too late. She'd known me that well. May. Celeste called back on schedule, 7 days later. The call was longer this time. She had a lot to tell me. The Pine Valley Emergency Research Station was a converted agricultural research facility, about 62 miles south-southeast of me, in a wide valley at lower elevation. It had been repurposed in the early weeks of the outbreak by a group that included several researchers from Ruth's professional network, a retired Army logistics officer named Bennett, and a small group of civilians who'd arrived at the right time and with useful skills. 9 people now. 3 had died in the first months. 2 from the infected, 1 from a medical emergency. The others had been there since last fall. They had consistent power. They had a greenhouse producing winter vegetables. They had a fuel supply adequate for another 18 months. They had a medical officer. They had, Celeste said in a flat tone that told me she considered this less important than it might seem, internet access from a Starlink terminal that was still pulling signal from orbit because the satellites didn't need the ground to be functional. She said the infected in their valley had been manageable with their fencing and their protocols. She said the biggest threat wasn't the infected. And here, her voice went to a different register, careful in a different way. The biggest threat was organized human groups that were moving through the area, taking resources. Groups, not individuals. Groups with vehicles and organized intent. I asked how far these groups ranged. She said, as far as they needed to. that there had been an incident at a farm about 40 miles from the station, in February, that she didn't want to describe in detail over the phone. Okay, I thought. She said that my position, high elevation, isolated, not on any map that these groups would have, was protective. She said that the cabin was probably the safest place within a 100-mile radius for a single person with adequate supplies. And then she said, "But we'd like you to come to the station if you're willing. We could use another person who's been operating alone in high-elevation terrain. We need someone who knows these mountains specifically. We have a project for spring, and we're short-handed." She said the route from my position to the station was theoretically passable, once the snow released enough to allow it, using a specific combination of Forest Service roads and one high-ridge crossing. She said the crossing was the problem, exposed, above tree line, and the last known position of a roving infected group was within 10 miles of the route. She said, think about it and call her back. I thought about it for 3 days. Those 3 days were strange. The cabin, which I'd been looking at as a shelter, a resource, a thing I'd built and maintained and improved over 7 months, suddenly looked different from a different angle. It looked like a place I could leave, and leaving had become complicated in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, not because of the physical danger, though that was real, but because of the weight of everything I'd put into it. I'd reinforced every window. I'd mapped every trail. I'd figured out the water pump and the solar and the battery bank and the trap lines and the best places to find animals and the best angles to approach the outpost and the spots where the infected had been seen most often, which were the low areas that sheltered them from wind, and the spots they didn't go, which were the exposed ridgelines. This cabin was not just a building anymore. It was a knowledge base. It was 7 months of figured-out things. Leaving it meant giving all that up. It meant going back to not knowing, to the first-day vulnerability of a new place, and new threats, and information I didn't have yet. Against 9 people, a greenhouse, medical care, Celeste's voice on the phone, which was efficient and a little cold, and suggested someone who was actually doing the work of keeping people alive, which was the kind of person you wanted nearby. Against 62 miles. A ridge crossing. Organized human groups on the roads. Against, also, the radio. Because in the second day of thinking it over, while I was doing the evening transmission window with the hand crank radio, something came through on a frequency I'd been ignoring. A short burst transmission, not a voice. A digital chirp that lasted about 10 seconds. I almost moved past it. Instead, I noted the frequency and checked it again the next evening, and it was there again. Same 10-second chirp, same frequency, regular as a clock. I knew what this was because I'd been in the field long enough. It was a beacon transmission. Someone, or something, was broadcasting a regular position beacon, the kind emergency locator transmitters put out. The frequency was wrong for an aviation ELT, but right for a personal locator beacon. Someone had a personal locator beacon running somewhere out there in the mountains, within probably 30 miles, based on the signal strength. I triangulated it as best I could with the directional antenna I improvised from the weather station gear. The signal was coming from the northeast. Not directly north, not east, but somewhere in between. High terrain, based on the line of sight with the ridge blocking some frequencies and not others. I called Celeste and told her about the beacon. She was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said, "There's a possibility that's one of ours. We lost contact with a 2-person team in February. They were checking a supply cache east of your position. We haven't heard from them." Lost contact? In February? I said, "What do you want me to do?" She said that was a decision only I could make. I spent the 3rd day walking the circuit of the property in the afternoon light, looking at everything I'd done to it, everything I'd added, everything I'd learned. The stake barriers around the north window, the wire across the porch, the trail I'd packed to the trap lines, now snow-free in the mornings, and refreezing at night with that crunch that meant the season was changing. The deer trail, where I'd gotten the doe, the meadow, where the child's footprints had been. I went to the meadow, stood in the middle of it. The snow was thinner here now, only 8 or 10 inches where it had been 3 feet in January. The spruce trees around the edge were releasing their lower branches from the snow's weight, lifting. A few small birds, mountain chickadees, moved through the branches above me, making their specific sound, that faint mechanical chirping. I stood there, and I thought about the footprints that had appeared, and then ended. I thought about Donnie outside the gas station, telling me to go back up the mountain. I thought about Danny's lockbox. I thought about Ruth's handwriting in the binder. I thought about Celeste saying, "We could use another person." I went back to the cabin, and I started making a list. Day 246. The roof. I need to go back and talk about the roof, because I mentioned it and then didn't explain it, and it should be explained. Beginning around February, maybe 10 or 12 days after I found the letter from Ruth, I started hearing sounds from the roof at night. Not wind sounds, not ice sounds, different. A weight moving across the surface. Slow, not all at once, not a dramatic thing. Just a subtle redistribution of pressure over the roof surface that made certain boards in the ceiling flex slightly, and that you could only hear if the inside was very quiet. The first time I heard it, I assumed it was a branch. A tree limb too close to the cabin, moving in the wind and dragging across the metal roof surface. I went out in the morning and checked. There were no branches within 10 feet of the cabin on the roof side. The nearest tree was 20 feet away and none of its limbs reached. The second time, I was awake at 3 in the morning, the stove low but warm enough, and I heard it distinctly. Something moving on the roof from the south edge toward the north peak, slow. Maybe 15 seconds to cross the full span, then nothing. I got the rifle and I went outside, and there was nothing on the roof. I looked at the snow around the cabin walls for evidence of something coming down from the roof. Nothing. Fresh snow on the ground, undisturbed. The third time, maybe 2 weeks later, I was reading. I'd found Ruth's small library of maybe 30 books, which I was going through slowly, and it happened again. The same track. South edge to north peak, the particular give of one board about a third of the way across that I'd started to identify as the noise marker. I went out immediately this time, got around the corner of the cabin in less than a minute. Nothing. But on the south edge of the roof, where the eaves overhung about 18 inches, there was something that hadn't been there before. In the shallow snow against the wall, right under the eave, a row of marks. Not footprints exactly, more like pressure marks. 4 of them, evenly spaced, roughly a hand's width, pointing away from the wall. Something had been on the eave, crouching there, or gripping it. I stood in the cold, looking at those marks for a long time. After that, I put it on the list of things without answers. The same list that had the child's footprints on it. The same list that had the 2 voices arguing in the dark in December on it. The mountains have things in them. I know that sounds like the beginning of a campfire story, but it's not. It's just an observation from someone who spent most of a year watching a specific piece of mountain closely. The mountains have things in them that are hard to explain and might not need explaining. The infected were weird enough, in their human, not human way. Other weirdness wasn't outside the range of things I'd accepted. I didn't go looking for whatever was on the roof. I didn't try to set a trap for it or stay awake waiting. I put a board of nails, tips up along the south eave. Primitive and probably ineffective, but it was something. The roof sounds stopped after that. Maybe the nails, maybe something else. I don't know. Day 256. Something happened that I have to describe carefully because the details matter and I want to get them right. I was on the ridge above the cabin. The ridge access was a scramble in winter, but in May, the snow had pulled back enough that I could get up there in an hour with the right footing. I'd made the climb 3 times in the past 2 weeks because the ridge gave me a 270-degree view of the terrain, and I was trying to assess routes, trying to map the practical path from the cabin to the Pine Valley station in my head before I committed to anything. Up there that morning, maybe 8 in the morning, clear sky. The kind of visibility you get in mountain mornings in late spring that makes you feel like you can see forever. I was scanning east with the 500mm lens attached to the Canon, looking toward the terrain where the beacon signal came from. I saw something moving on a slope about 2 miles east. Not one thing. maybe a dozen things. At that range, the 500mm was necessary, and even then, the image shimmered with air movement. They were infected. The way they moved, that specific not quite right gait, was visible even at 2 miles to an eye that had been watching them for 7 months. About a dozen of them, spread loosely across an open snowfield at maybe 8,000 feet elevation, moving south. Then I panned right slightly and saw something else. A person, a single person, above the infected group on the slope, on what looked like a rock outcrop, standing, not moving, watching the infected or watching something on the other side. A person, alive. The posture was wrong for infected, too deliberate, too still in a controlled way versus the idle drift of the infected. I kept the lens on this figure for probably 4 minutes. They didn't move. The infected group below continued south, drifting slowly, and the person on the rock watched them go and then, this is what got me, turned and looked directly at me. I know this is improbable at 2 miles. I know they couldn't have seen me, but they turned to face my position, directly, and stood there. I lowered the camera. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the day at the cabin trying to figure out what I'd seen. A survivor, obviously. Not infected. Too deliberate. Too aware. Someone who knew how to watch the infected without attracting them. Someone positioned high, using the terrain. Someone like me. I called Celeste that evening, described what I'd seen, the location as precisely as I could figure, the direction of movement after the infected group had passed. She was quiet again in that particular way she had. Then, that could be Barrow, the 2-person team we lost. One of them was named Barrow. Barrow. I wrote it down. Day 271. The person arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. I knew they were coming before they arrived, because I'd been watching the North Trail with the camera every morning and afternoon, and on this afternoon, I saw a figure moving through the upper tree line about half a mile out. I had the rifle. I had the shutters cracked and the bar down on the door. I watched through the window as the figure came down through the trees, slowly, stopping often, checking behind them, the way someone who'd been tracked too many times checks behind them. Small, shorter than I'd expected from the ridge. Moving carefully, not the hurried scramble of someone in immediate danger, but the considered pace of someone who'd been doing this a long time. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing in front of the cabin. About 30 meters out, I said, through the shutter crack. Not loud, not a shout. Something between, I can see you. Are you hurt? A pause. Then, in a voice that was rough from either cold or thirst, or not having used it much, are you Garrett Hale? I was so surprised by my own name that I didn't answer for a moment. Then, yes. The figure said, Celeste sent me. His name was Nolan Barrow. He was 31 years old, former outdoor education instructor, one of the 2-person team that Celeste had lost contact with in February. The other member of the team, a woman named Pippa, had not made it. He didn't want to talk about how or exactly where, and I didn't push. You learn quickly to not push on those subjects. He'd been alone in the mountains for 3 months. The personal locator beacon had been his. He'd kept it on, because Celeste's instructions were to keep it on if possible, so they could track survivors. And he'd kept following orders, even when he wasn't sure orders mattered anymore. He was thin in a way that suggested the food problem had been worse for him than for me. I could see his collarbones through the neck of his jacket, which was a puffy down jacket with one sleeve held together by duct tape. He stood in my kitchen and drank 2 full cups of water and ate a bowl of bean soup without speaking. Then he said, "You've been here since October?" I said yes. He looked around the kitchen, at the repaired electric, the stored food, the rifle on the hook by the door, the neat line of mason jars on the shelf. At the cabin generally, the evidence of someone who'd been systematically working at the problem for 7 months. He said, "Your aunt must have been something." I said she was. He told me what things looked like below. This was information I'd been thirsting for in the abstract, from the distance of the satellite phone calls, but hearing it from someone who'd actually been through the lowland areas recently was different, more specific, more visceral. He said the towns within 50 miles of the valley were mostly empty. Not all destroyed, a lot of them just empty. People gone or dead, businesses sitting with their doors open. The infected weren't uniformly everywhere. They clustered in certain areas and avoided others. Higher ground, consistent with what Celeste had said. They didn't go above a certain elevation. He'd used that repeatedly to move safely. The organized groups, this was the part I'd been most afraid to hear about specifically. He said there were two that he knew of in this region. One was a group of about 40 that had set up in a town called Granville, southwest of the valley. They were aggressive about expanding their resource control and had a working fuel supply. The other group was smaller, maybe 15, and less organized, and more dangerous in the specific way that less organized groups with weapons were dangerous. Neither group, to his knowledge, was aware of the Pine Valley station or of my cabin. The route to Pine Valley from here, he said, was hard but doable. He'd come most of the way from that direction, though not along exactly the same path Celeste had described. There was a section about 20 miles out where the road conditions were bad. A bridge was out, which complicated a vehicle approach, but on foot it was fine, just a ford through water that was cold but not deep this time of year. Beyond that, open terrain with good cover. He said, "Celeste says you know these mountains." I said I'd learned them. Not the same thing. He said, "She wants you to guide part of the route. The high section, the ridge crossing. She's planning a resupply run in both directions, and they need someone who knows the high terrain." So that was it. That was what the project was. I fed him properly and gave him the storage room to sleep in with the better sleeping bag, and I sat up by the stove that night thinking about what he'd said, about being needed somewhere, about Celeste's voice on the phone, efficient and certain, about 9 people in a valley 60 miles south making a greenhouse work and keeping the lights on. I'd spent 7 months learning how to be a single person in a specific location. Now someone was asking me to put that knowledge towards something larger. Day 278. Nolan had been at the cabin for a week. He was eating better, moving better, talking more. He was the kind of person who got quiet when he was stressed and gradually came out the other side when things improved. I understood that kind. I was that kind. We fell into the routine naturally, which I found interesting. Not the routine itself, which we adapted slightly for 2 people versus 1, but the fact of it. The routine of the cabin had always been mine alone, and it turned out it needed almost no modification to include a second person. He took the trap line in the mornings while I did the property check. I did the firewood mid-morning while he organized and inventoried what we had. We talked during meals and were quiet outside meals. It was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when 2 people's habits happen to fit together. On day 4 of his stay, he said something that I wrote down because it stayed with me. He said, "I spent a lot of time out there thinking about what I was surviving for, like, the reason for it. Because survival for its own sake gets thin after a while. It's not enough." I asked him what he decided. He said, "I decided it didn't have to be a reason, just a direction. You don't need a reason to walk towards something. You just need a direction." I thought about that for a few days. On day 6, he and I did a reconnaissance run together. Not the full route to Pine Valley, just the first 8 miles northward along the terrain I knew best, scoping the path Celeste had described. We moved in the early morning, when the cold kept the infected clustered in the low areas, and the light was good. What I'd feared about leaving the cabin, the vulnerability of not knowing, turned out to be less paralyzing than I'd expected when there were 2 of us. 2 people checking both directions, 2 people reading the terrain, 2 pairs of eyes on the tree lines. I was more competent out there than I'd realized, in part because I hadn't realized what 7 months of learning had built into my reactions. I moved through the trees without thinking about it. I read the snow surface for tracks without deciding to read it. I knew when to stop and when to keep going in a way that felt like instinct but was just accumulated information. The first 8 miles were clean. No signs of the infected on the high terrain. 1 set of tracks, very old, probably January or earlier, that might have been infected, or might have been someone alive. A collapsed section of trail that we worked around. a slope above a frozen stream that I marked as avalanche risk, and we gave wide berth to. We got back to the cabin by early afternoon. Nolan looked at the terrain in my direction from the porch and said, "That's manageable." I said, "Yeah." Day 285. It was the deer that found it, and finding it was the thing that almost broke what I'd been holding together. I'd been watching the same deer trail, the one where I'd gotten the doe in March, and checking it in the mornings for fresh sign. On this morning the deer trail was there, but the deer had been spooked off it. I could see from the tracks where they'd come to the usual spot, and then diverted hard left, all of them at once, the whole group turning together like something had scared them. I followed the diversion, and it led me down a slope I didn't usually go, and into a low area that was sheltered from the wind by the terrain, and thus warmer than the surrounding ground by a few degrees. And in that low area, in the hollow between two slopes, about 300 meters from the cabin, were 7 infected. They weren't moving toward the cabin. They weren't moving at all. They were standing, clustered in this low, warm area, facing different directions, doing nothing, not responding to the deer's movement, not responding to my presence at the edge of their visual range, which was about 50 meters in that low light. 7 infected, 300 meters from where I slept. I backed out slowly, the way I'd learned to back out, without sudden movement, without changing the pace, keeping myself from making the instinctive hurrying up that every prey animal made, and that was exactly the trigger for attention. I went back to the cabin, and I told Nolan, and we spent the rest of the day not moving. Here's what I'd learned, and what was important to understand. The infected weren't smart. They couldn't plan, couldn't communicate, couldn't set traps or coordinate. They moved towards sound and heat and movement. In cold weather they congregated in low, sheltered, slightly warmer areas, and went relatively dormant. Not dead dormant, not unresponsive, but less active. In warm weather, they ranged further and more actively. The problem with 7 of them 300 meters from the cabin was not immediate danger. It was proximity. If something generated noise near the cabin, a loud sound, something that drew their attention, 7 of them 300 meters away could cover that distance in about 3 minutes. 3 minutes was not a lot of time. We moved carefully for 3 days. No loud sounds. Voice-level communication only. Nolan suggested we check whether they'd move on their own, and they did. On the 2nd day, the cluster had reduced to 4. On the 3rd day, 2, and by the 4th day, they were gone. They'd drifted somewhere. But those 4 days reminded me of something I'd been letting myself forget as the weather improved and the routine felt solid. The infected were always out there. The baseline was never safe. You adapted and improved your safety margins, and you stayed smart, but you never got to put the weight all the way down. Day 291. The radio. Not the hand crank, not the satellite phone. The radio Nolan had been carrying in his pack, a military-style handheld with a longer range than mine, picked up something on day 291 that I want to describe as carefully as I can, because it's the event that made the decision for me. We were doing the evening check of frequencies, which we did together now, sitting at the kitchen table with the radio between us. Most frequencies were static or empty, or the occasional bleed from the official repeating broadcast that no longer meant anything. But Nolan had a frequency list that Celeste had given him, a set of channels they monitored. And on one of those channels, channel 12 in their nomenclature, something came through. A voice. Live, not recorded. A man's voice. Talking quickly, low, like he was trying not to be overheard. He was talking about Granville, the organized group Nolan had mentioned, the 40-person settlement to the southwest. He was talking about it, and what he was saying was, they knew about Pine Valley. Someone had told them, or they'd found it some other way. And they were planning to move on it within a month. Then the signal cut out. Nolan was leaning over the radio, and when it cut out, he straightened up slowly. His face told me he was doing the same math I was. Celeste didn't know. She hadn't mentioned it on the last call, which had been 2 days ago. Either the transmission was recent intelligence she didn't have, or Or the source on Channel 12 was someone inside the Granville group who was warning the station. I said, "We need to go." Nolan said, "I know." Day 293. I spent 2 days preparing. What you take when you leave a place you've lived in for 10 months is not the same as what you take when you pack for a 3-day field shoot. I'd made lists and remade them again, and ultimately the choice came down to what I could carry in the pack that would keep me alive for 3 days in the mountains, and what was so important it was worth slowing down for. The rifle, obviously. 50 rounds in the breast pocket, another 50 in the pack. The satellite phone, essential, and I charged it to full. The Canon with the spare battery charged, the 500mm lens and the wider 2470, the memory cards, because I didn't know when I'd be able to replace any of it, and because I was still, underneath everything, a photographer. The manual from the binder, Ruth's manual. Her handwriting, I couldn't leave that. The notebook, this notebook, the letter. The practical supplies, 3 days of food from the emergency rations, plus whatever from the cellar I could compress into 1 layer of the pack. First aid from the kit Danny had left. 2 liters of water, treated. Fire kit, space blanket, headlamp. What I didn't take, the trapping equipment, the woodpile, the solar battery bank, the root cellar's months of food, the 2 cords of knowledge about how to live in this specific place. The cabin would stay. Whatever it had been to me, it would stay. I'd bar the door on the way out and close the shutters and put everything in order and leave it for whoever came next. That felt like the right thing to do. Leave it for whoever came next. I walked through it the evening of day 293. Each room, the front room with the stove and the mattress on the floor, and the battery-powered Christmas lights still in the window frame. The kitchen, with the map pinned above the table, and the neat row of jars on the shelf. The storage room, where Nolan had slept, tidy now, the sleeping bag folded. The root cellar. I opened the hatch and went down and looked at what remained. The rows of jars, the half-emptied bins of rice and beans, the pickled things. More than enough for someone else to start with. Ruth's bedroom, which I'd barely touched in 10 months. I hadn't felt right about using it. The quilt on the bed was hand-stitched, the pattern geometric, something she'd made herself probably. There were 3 framed photographs on the wall, mountain photographs, taken from the ridge above, showing the cabin from above in 3 different seasons. Whoever had taken them had a good eye. I looked at them for a while. Then I took one off the wall and put it in the pack, because I wanted to remember what this place looked like from outside, from above, from a distance that made it look small and possible. Day 294. Departure. We left at 5 in the morning, before first light. The logic was simple. The infected were least active in the pre-dawn cold, and we needed the darkness to cover the first mile through the low area where they'd clustered. I'd moved through that low area 3 times in the past week to map the current infected distribution. 7 of them had become 12, which told me the warmer late spring temperatures were starting to bring them out of their winter sluggishness and concentrate them in the warm hollows. Moving through it in the dark was the safest option. We moved silent. This is the thing that sounds simple and isn't, in practice, in real snow that was icy in the early morning cold. Every step had to be placed, not just taken, rolled down from heel to toe, weight transferred deliberately. I'd learned this in 8 months of doing it alone, and I'd talked through it with Nolan in the preceding days, and he understood, and he was good at it, better than I'd expected from someone who'd been through what he'd been through. We cleared the low area in 25 minutes. I know because I counted. The next hour was a climb. The route went northeast and up, toward the ridge, toward the high section that would give us the crossing into the upper drainage, and then the long descent toward the valley system that would eventually, after 3 days walking, bring us to Pine Valley. The ridge crossing was the technical crux. I'd planned this carefully. The crossing was exposed, above tree line, open to wind, no cover, and it crossed a section of moderate avalanche terrain. What I knew from 10 months of watching the snowpack from below was that the southern aspect slopes, where we'd be crossing, had been releasing naturally through the spring melt cycle. The big releases had happened. What was left was manageable. Not nothing, never nothing, but manageable. On the ridge, at the top of the approach, the sun came up. I have photographed a lot of sunrises. I have been in the field in 4 continents for specific kinds of light, and I have waited many hours in many cold places for the specific moment when the light changes from absence to presence. It is never the same twice, and it is always right when it happens. That pure mathematical shift from dark to light. This one came up over the eastern peaks with the particular gold of high altitude, and it lit the snowfields and the distant ridges and the valley we were crossing toward in a way that made the whole world look like it was made of the same clean material. The shadows were blue-purple in the snow hollows. The lit peaks were the color of old honey. Nolan was walking ahead and he stopped and looked at it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Jesus." I had the camera out, already on, already to eye, framing. The old habit, the old impulse. I shot about 40 frames in the 30 seconds before we started moving again. Moving because we had to, because the light was irrelevant to the avalanche risk and the exposed ridge and the miles still ahead. But I shot them. We crossed the ridge in 40 minutes. The terrain on the far side was better. North-facing, good tree cover, a clear line of descent into the upper drainage. We moved faster. The infected were not a presence at this elevation. Nolan confirmed what I'd observed, that they didn't seem to function above 7,000 feet in any sustained way, which put our route mostly in good territory. 12 miles the first day. We camped in a dense grove of Engelmann spruce at about 8,000 feet, made a small fire from deadfall because the temperature at night still dropped to something serious, and heated water for the last of the dehydrated ration pouches. We didn't talk much around the fire. Not from tension. It wasn't tense. More like we'd each been inside our own head for so long that the habit of quiet was strong. Then Nolan said, "Do you think it's actually there?" I said. Celeste's voice was real. He said, "Yeah." I said, "The automated response was running. For months, someone was maintaining it." He nodded. He poked the fire with a stick. He said, "I believed in it all winter because I had to. Now I'm close enough that not believing in it feels more dangerous." I thought about that. Then I said, "That's what it was like with the cabin. I believed the food would hold, the solar would work, the traps would catch something. I believed it, because the alternative was not believing it." He said, "Did it always work?" I said, "No, but mostly." Day 296. Second day. The terrain was lower and more complicated. We were in the transition zone between high alpine and lower subalpine, which meant more human infrastructure, old roads, some buildings, more areas where infected might be present. We moved more carefully. The Forest Service road we were following was marked on Danny's map with several of his hand notations, and I'd transferred the relevant ones to my topo. One of them said caution, 3 days active infected sign, dated February 15th. Old intelligence. But I filed it, and we moved slower through that section. The bridge-out spot Nolan had mentioned was a concrete Forest Service bridge over a fast stream. The deck gone, probably washed in a winter flood. The ford was thigh-deep and moving fast, but crossable on a diagonal upstream angle, which we did quickly, pulling our boots and pants off first and putting them back on the other side. Cold enough that the feeling didn't come back into my feet for 10 minutes. But functional. Mid-afternoon, we came to a spot that Celeste had mentioned, a junction of 2 Forest Service roads that had a concrete storage facility, a small windowless building that the Forest Service used for equipment staging. She'd said it might have useful materials. We checked it. The door was a heavy padlock that I opened with bolt cutters from my pack, another thing Ruth's shed had provided. Inside, 2 propane tanks, a weather station instrument package still in the box, 4 crates of drinking water in sealed bottles, a hand dolly, and 3 sleeping bags, commercial quality. We took the sleeping bags and 2 crates of water and as much propane as we could carry. Also inside, a small chalkboard on the wall that someone had written on in chalk, writing that was recent. The chalk was still crisp, not faded or dusted over. It said, "This place is being watched. Keep moving." No signature. We looked at each other. We left. We moved faster. I don't know who wrote that. I don't know if we were being watched or if it was a warning left for anyone who came by. Either way, we didn't slow down again until we were 3 miles clear. Day 297, third day, the approach. Pine Valley opened up below us in the early afternoon. I say opened up because that's what valleys do from above. They just appear when you top the right ridge, the whole thing visible at once. Farmland, mostly flat, bounded on the east and west by ridges. A cluster of buildings near the center that from this distance looked intact and lit. Actual lights, even in daytime. Movement near the buildings. Nolan stopped and looked, and then he made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I had the 500mm out. I dialed in and looked. The buildings were grouped around a central courtyard. I could see now that it was the converted agricultural station Celeste had described. Solar panels on multiple roofs. A greenhouse running along the south wall of the main structure. The polyethylene sheeting catching the afternoon light. A perimeter fence, not a high wall, but a substantial fence, maybe 8 feet, with what looked like additional obstacles outside it. 3 people were visible outside the main building, 2 on the fence perimeter, and 1 in the garden area adjacent to the greenhouse. And there were lights on inside. I kept the lens on those lights for a long time. Then I passed the camera to Nolan and watched his face while he looked. He lowered the camera after about a minute. His face was, I don't have a better word for it than undone, like something that had been held very tight for a very long time had come loose all at once. We started down. I don't know what I expected, coming into the station. Something cleaner, maybe, more definitive. The movies would have it be a gate opening, a hero's welcome, a moment of orchestrated arrival. What actually happened? We came through a break in the outer fence line at a spot Nolan knew from his previous visit, and a young woman on perimeter watch saw us and shouted something back toward the main building. A few people came out. They looked at us the way people looked at things they wanted to be real and were afraid might not be. Celeste was the last one out. She was taller than I'd imagined from her voice, angular, mid-50s, gray hair, cut practically short. She shook Nolan's hand first and said his name, and for a moment her efficient face went somewhere else entirely, somewhere that suggested she hadn't been completely sure he was alive. Then she looked at me. She said, "Garrett Hale, you look like you've been in the mountains for 10 months. I said, "I have been." She said, "Good. We have a lot to talk about. But first," she gestured toward the building, toward the door. "You should eat something." Inside, the main building was warm, in a way the cabin had never quite been. Not warm enough warm, actually warm. The kind of warmth that comes from an enclosed space with multiple people in it. I'd forgotten what that felt like. The specific quality of air that belonged to a room with people in it. I sat at a table, and someone put food in front of me, and I ate without talking for a while. Soup, real soup, with actual vegetables from the greenhouse. Carrots and greens and something that might have been beans. Bread that was denser than Ruth's recipe but good. There were 9 people total, though 2 were outside on watch. The ones in the room looked at me and at Nolan with the particular look of people who'd been a closed group for a long time and hadn't seen new faces. It was welcoming and slightly evaluating at the same time, which was fine. That was reasonable. You didn't just accept people because they showed up. I'd learned that. Celeste sat across from me with a mug of something and waited until I'd eaten before she said, "The radio transmission you heard on Channel 12, about Granville." I said yes. She said, "We know. We've known for 4 days. Someone in that group has been in contact with us, a woman named Claire who'd been with them since winter and wasn't happy with the direction they were going. She's the one on the radio." I said, "So what does that mean?" Celeste said, "It means we have about 2 weeks, maybe 3. They're not organized enough for anything sooner." I said, "What are we going to do?" She said, "That's what we've been discussing. We have 3 options." She said them one by one, flat, without dramatizing. Option 1, dig in. Strengthen the perimeter, prepare to absorb a confrontation, and see whether the Granville group was actually willing to do violence or was just posturing. Risk. If they were willing, 9 people couldn't hold against 40 indefinitely. Option 2. Relocate. Abandon the station. Take what they could move. Establish a new location. Risk. Losing the infrastructure they'd spent months building. The greenhouse. The power. The water system. Going back to the kind of daily survival math I'd been doing for the first months in the cabin. Option 3. Something she described carefully as an approach, meaning contact with the Granville group. See what they actually wanted. See if Claire's intelligence was accurate, or whether the situation was more complicated than 40 people planning an attack. She said, "I'd like to know what you think." I'd been there for 2 hours. I'd just walked 60 miles. I had a mug of something warm in my hands and a full stomach, and I was sitting inside a room with other people for the first time in 10 months. She was asking me what I thought. I said, "How much do you know about Claire?" Celeste described her. 40 years old, former school teacher, ended up with the Granville group because they were the first organized thing she'd found, and she needed to be with other people, and they seemed functional at first. Had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the group's leadership, a man named Driscoll who Celeste described with the particular economy of someone who'd decided their opinion long ago. I said, "Can you get Claire out?" Celeste said, "Possibly. She's been careful." I said, "Because if Claire's out, your intelligence source is out, which means you lose your warning window. But if she's out, you potentially have one more person who knows Granville's internal layout and planning." Celeste looked at me across the table. She said, "You spent 10 months alone taking pictures of wildlife." I said, "I spent 10 months thinking about problems." Something happened in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She said, "Yes, we can get Claire out." The days after, I'll record these briefly because they're still recent and I'm still inside them, not far enough back to see the shape yet. They put me in a room with a real bed, the first real bed in 10 months. I didn't sleep well, which surprised me. I'd assumed that a real bed would knock me out immediately. Instead, I lay awake in the unfamiliar warmth and the unfamiliar sounds of other people in other rooms, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the cabin. I thought about the bar lock on the front door, which would hold. I thought about the root cellar, sealed up with everything inside it. I thought about the trap line to the east, the spring-loaded traps probably needing to be reset, the meadow where the child's footprints had been. I thought about whether I'd left the thing in a condition where the next person who needed it could use it, whether someone else could go through the generator shed and find the manual binder and read Ruth's careful handwriting and understand. I thought I'd done a decent job of that. The photographs I'd taken on the ridge, the 40 frames at sunrise, I didn't look at them yet. I was saving them for when I had time to look at them properly, which was a photographer's habit. Don't rush the review. Don't look at the work until you're ready to see it clearly. I met the other people one at a time over the first few days. Bennett, the logistics officer, who was the oldest of the group and had a quality of unrattled steadiness that I recognized because Ruth had had it too. A young man named Wes, who was maybe 22, and had been a nursing student and was now the group's medical person by necessity, and was good at it in the way that people who are thrown into something they're almost but not quite trained for sometimes are. A woman named Helen who was mid-40s, and had been a biologist at the agricultural station originally, and now ran the greenhouse with an efficiency that reminded me of the trap lines, systematic, no waste, exactly what the situation required. And Claire arrived on day 8. She came in at night. Nolan had gone out to meet her at a prearranged point and brought her the last 10 miles with a wide arc around Granville's known patrol routes. She was wearing clothes that were too big for her, and she had a bruise on the left side of her face that she didn't explain right away, and that no one pressed her on immediately. She sat in the kitchen and drank water and looked at the room. She said, "They had a vote about this place, about coming here." Celeste said, "And?" Claire said, "It wasn't unanimous. That's important. There are people in that group who don't want to do this. Maybe a third of them. Driscoll's been telling people they have to take what they need, that there's no other way. But a lot of them know that's not true. They've just been going along because going along was what you did. Celeste said, "How much time do we have?" Claire said, 2 weeks at most. Maybe 10 days. What followed was 5 days of planning that I'll describe in summary, because the details were tactical, and tactical details have their own exhausting specificity. The plan that emerged was Celeste's third option, an approach, but with a structure to it. We would send a message to Granville. Not a threat, not a concession. A message that made a specific offer and gave a specific deadline, and that was sent in a way that bypassed Driscoll and went directly to the third of the group who weren't certain. The message said, approximately, "We exist. We have food, power, and medical care. We are not enemies. We are not a resource to be taken. If you want to discuss terms for a mutual arrangement, contact us on Channel 12 before the deadline." The signal for whether it was working was whether Channel 12 went quiet, Driscoll monitoring it, getting cautious, or stayed active, meaning the dissenting voices were still there. Claire sat with Celeste every evening going over names and personalities in the Granville group. Who was persuadable, who wasn't, who had skills they needed, who was potentially dangerous regardless of outcome. I sat in on some of those conversations. Mostly I listened. On day 12 after I'd arrived, during the third planning session, Claire was describing a man in the Granville group who she said was the one she was most worried about, Driscoll's closest ally, a man named Peter, who she said had been the one who'd hit her. She described him factually, without particular heat, the way you described a problem you'd already solved in your head. And I thought, she sounds like Celeste, the same flat economy, the same quality of having thought through the emotional part already, and now just working on the practical part. I thought, this is what survival sounds like when it's been going on long enough. Not stoic, not unfeeling, just processed. The emotions go somewhere, you come back with the practical version. The thing about Peter, he wasn't in the group anymore. He'd left Granville 4 days before Claire did, taking 3 other people and heading northwest. Claire didn't know where. That was both a relief, one less problem, and a worry, because 3 armed people heading northwest in unpredictable directions was unpredictable. We kept the beacon Nolan had been running. We kept it active. If Peter's group or anyone else found the frequency, found us, showed up, we'd deal with it. Day 300. I want to record this specific day because the number feels like something, even though numbers are arbitrary, and the actual significance of any day is what happens in it, and not the number attached to it. I know that, but still. 300 days since October 15th, since I drove up the mountain road in my F-250 with $40,000 of camera gear and a photo project and no idea. In those 300 days, I had not died, which was not a given. I had not gone crazy, which was closer than I'd like to think. I had eaten snowshoe hare and squirrel and venison and old strawberry jam from an underground cellar and Danny's emergency rations and hares that I caught with my aunt's traps using techniques from a paperback book, and I had been warm enough most of the time and cold enough some of the time and nearly frozen once. And I had fixed the solar and rewired the battery bank and laid the trap lines and kept the rifle clean and shot 1 deer and a grouse and a lot of hares and read all 30 of Ruth's books and slept on a mattress on the floor next to a wood stove and talked to my dead aunt and felt afraid in a specific and manageable way nearly every day and felt something like peace in the early mornings when the light was right and the mountains were doing what they did. And I had walked 60 miles to get here, to this room, with these 9 people and now Claire, which made 10. And the cabin was still up there, still standing, the shutters closed and the door barred, and the root cellar full, and the trap lines waiting. On day 300, Celeste called me into her office, the director's office from the agricultural station, still furnished with a government-issue desk, and 2 chairs, and a whiteboard where someone had been keeping a supply inventory in green marker. She said, "We got a response. From Channel 12. From a voice that wasn't Claire's, and wasn't any voice we recognized. A man, older, who said, 'We'd like to talk. Not everyone here agrees with what was being planned. Some of us think this has been wrong from the beginning. We'll come to the fence. 3 people, unarmed, daylight tomorrow, if that's acceptable. Celeste looked at me across the desk. She said, "It might be nothing. It might be Driscoll playing a different angle." I said, "Or it might be the third." She said, "The third." The third who didn't want to do it. The third who'd been going along, because going along was what you did when you were scared, and organized violence felt like safety. The third who'd gotten a message on Channel 12 that went directly to them and said, "There's another way." She said, "I want you at the fence meeting." I said, "Why me?" She said, "Because you've been outside, more recently than any of us. You read terrain. You'll see if it's a setup before it gets close enough to matter." I said, "Okay." She said, "And Garrett?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Ruth was right about you." I didn't have an answer for that. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "I hope so." I went back to my room, and I sat on the real bed with the photograph of the cabin, the one I'd taken off Ruth's wall, in my hands. The photograph taken from the ridge above, the cabin visible below, small and specific in the landscape, the log walls, the metal roof, the snow around it deep and clean and white. I thought about what it looked like from inside, the stove, the morning light through the shutters at the right angle, that specific bar of yellow that crossed the kitchen floor around 8 in the morning in winter, and that I'd photographed 3 times before the battery died on the Canon. I thought about the shape that had stood at the tree line on Halloween, getting covered with snow, and all the shapes after it, the way they moved, slightly wrong, not something you could describe adequately to someone who hadn't seen it. I thought about Danny at 23 and his sleeping bag at the ranger outpost, his box of useful things under a rock for someone who came later. I thought about Donnie outside the gas station, back against the wall, eyes on the ground. Go back up the mountain. I thought about the child's footprints crossing the meadow and ending at the tree line. I've been trying to write all of this down before the details compress further, before the mountain becomes a story I tell instead of a place I lived. That's what happens. Everything eventually becomes the version of itself that fits in conversation, the short form, the headline. 10 months on a mountain, survived a zombie outbreak, built a bunker from a cabin. The headline doesn't have the bar of morning light across the kitchen floor. It doesn't have Ruth's handwriting on the last page of the binder. It doesn't have the moment when a hare with its nose to the ground moved through a spruce shadow, and I caught it in the frame, and the world was, for exactly 1/1000th of a second, perfectly composed. The fence meeting is tomorrow morning. I've been working for a long time on being the right kind of person for whatever tomorrow requires. Being present, seeing what's actually there, instead of what you're afraid of or hoping for. Making the next right decision. I don't know what it'll look like. I know the terrain. I know the approach routes and the sight lines and the places where cover is good and the places where it isn't. I know what it sounds like when something's off, and I know how to hold still. The other day Wes, the nursing student, was looking at my hands while he was checking a small cut I'd gotten on the fence repair. He said, "Your hands look like someone who does manual labor." I said, "I guess they do now." He said, "What did they look like before?" I thought about it. A photographer's hands. Long hours in cold air. Camera grip. The specific wear pattern on the right thumb from the shutter button. I said, "Like someone who worked outside." He said, "Not that different then." No, not that different in the end. The photograph from the ridge is on the table next to the bed. The cabin in its snow, from above, small and sufficient. Someone built that place with specific intent and left it for someone specific, and that person used it the way it was meant to be used and left it the way it was meant to be left. I took a lot of photographs in 10 months. Of the mountains, the animals, the light, the infected at distance through a long lens, the terrain I traveled, the trap lines in dawn light, the solar panels I rewired, the stove that kept me alive, the bedroom window with the board and spike barrier outside it, the meadow where the footprints appeared and ended, the ridge sunrise the morning Nolan and I crossed. When I finally sit down and go through all of it, all 40+ thousand frames from 10 months, I don't know what the story is going to look like, whether the arc of it will be visible in the images, whether someone looking at them in order would be able to tell what happened to the person taking them. I think they probably would. The hands change. In the photographs where I use the timer and put myself in frame, the face changes. The quality of stillness in how I'm standing changes. You can see someone learning how to be in a specific place, learning how to belong to the cold and the altitude, instead of just visiting it. That's something. The fence meeting is tomorrow. I'm going to close this notebook now and sleep, and in the morning I'm going to get up and eat something, and go stand at the fence line with whatever judgment 10 months on a mountain has built into me, and see what comes. Ruth left me a rifle sighted to 80 meters. She left me a root cellar, 8 months of food, trapping equipment, a solar system, a battery bank, storm shutters, a generator, a workshop full of tools, a satellite phone, a letter in her handwriting, 30 books, and a cabin at 7,400 feet with a view of the ridge. She left me what I needed to live through this, and she knew what I'd need, which is something I'm still not entirely sure I've earned. Okay, Ruth, I hear you. I'm going. The notebook ends there. There's one more entry, added later. Different ink, the handwriting slightly different, smaller, like it was written in a hurry or in bad light. It says, "The meeting happened. 3 of them came. The man who'd called on Channel 12 was named Aldous, 57, former high school principal. The other 2 were a couple, maybe late 30s, whose names I didn't catch because everything moved fast. Aldous stood at the fence and told us what was happening inside Granville. He was specific and careful and didn't dramatize it. He said 14 of the 40 wanted no part of what Driscoll was planning. He said 5 of the 14 were willing to leave. He said the others were too afraid of Driscoll or too dependent on the security the group provided, or both. He said, "We'd like to come here, the 5 of us, and then we'd like to help you figure out what to do about the rest of them." Celeste stood next to me at the fence and listened to all of it. Then she looked at me. I looked at Aldous. Former high school principal with a calm face and careful words and the specific bearing of someone who'd been managing other people's fear for a long time and knew how. I said, "The 5 of you, when can you leave?" He said, 48 hours. Celeste said, "Come." Aldous nodded, looked at the station behind us, the greenhouse catching the morning light, smoke from the chimney, the evidence of people who'd kept something going. He said, "I hoped this place was real. I wasn't sure." I said, "It's real." He turned to go, then he stopped and looked back at me specifically. He said, "How long have you been here?" I said, 10 months on a mountain before this, 3 weeks here. He said, "The mountain." I said, "Yeah." He nodded slowly. The look on his face was the particular look of someone who understood what that meant, because they'd been outside too, and they knew what staying alive out there cost. He said, "Tell me about it sometime." I said, "Yeah, I will." He walked back toward his group, and I stood at the fence and watched him go. And the morning light was doing something specific to the ridgeline above the valley, and I watched it without the camera for once. Just watched it. Just let it be in front of me, without the frame. The mountains were still up there, all of them. The San Juans going north and east, and the specific ridge above the cabin, catching the light the way it always did. That early morning gold that Nolan had said Jesus to. Ruth's cabin was up there in the snow, waiting. The world had not ended. It had changed in ways that were irreversible and ways that were not. And the line between those 2 categories was something we were all going to spend a long time figuring out. But the light was real. The ridge was real. Aldous was walking back to 40 people and figuring out which 14 of them were about to do something brave, and Celeste was already on the satellite phone, and Nolan was somewhere behind me, making a joke to Helen about the greenhouse tomatoes that made her actually laugh, and somewhere in the trees above the valley, something was moving. Deer probably, maybe elk, something with weight and life, moving through the spruce in its own morning routine. not knowing or caring about any of this. Something alive, up in the trees, doing what it did. That was enough to keep going on. That was enough.